if we look at how that literacy engagement framework that I spoke about gets realized in practice, we've got to ask, what can we do to increase students' literacy engagement? If a student comes in, say grade 5 or 6 or 7, and doesn't speak much English, surely we've got to teach him or her English before they can get engaged with literacy in English. If a student is coming in from a low-income background and doesn't have much access to print in the home, well, then surely we've got to teach him or her the basics before we kind of throw a lot of books at him or her. In actual fact, we need to focus in on practices that have been documented in many schools, practices that have a strong research basis that show how we can scaffold instruction so the students can get involved in literacy at an early stage, how they can showcase their intellectual accomplishments. We need to look at how some schools have successfully connected instruction to students' lives, how they've created identity-affirming spaces for all students so that a student who doesn't speak English doesn't feel somehow less valuable in the class than students who do. That for a lot of students, they want to kind of disappear because they're embarrassed by the fact that they can't express themselves, they can't express their intelligence, their humor, etc. So how do we create what has sometimes been viewed as a deficit how do we change it into something that is seen positively by students and by the entire school community? I'll take you inside one classroom in one school that show in very simple ways, in ways that are essentially no cost. There's no fancy computer programs here, there's no special resources. What there is a mindset where in the first instance that I'll share with you, the teacher, a person called Lisa Leone, a very inspired and inspiring teacher that we had the fortune to work with, she became conscious of the fact that her school as a whole and her classroom up to that point had essentially been an English-only zone. That there was an invisible sign on the wall that said English-only zone. Students knew it, teachers knew it, and she reached up and took down that invisible sign and opened up the classroom space so that students could use their first languages if they wanted to. They could use the totality of their background experience. They could tap into what they knew, including their first language, to carry out the intellectual tasks and challenges of the classroom. In this school there was a large Muslim population, a large ESOL population generally. And let me just show you some of the dual language work that these students did in Lisa's classroom. One student had come in from Israel in grade 6 without speaking any English or minimal English. His father had worked in agricultural settings in Israel. He was very interested in horses. And when they were doing writing in class, rather than just have the students do some little exercises in English, workbook stuff that a lot of teachers will do with early stage ESOL learners, the teacher encouraged students to write stories. Well, this student, Tomer, was not in a position to write a story in English because he didn't know any English. So she encouraged him to write a story in Hebrew, in which he was literate. He was coming from a strong educational background in Israel. And then they found a way to get his story from Hebrew into English. There was a teacher in the school who spoke Hebrew who helped him translate it. So the story, a story called Tom Goes to Kentucky, Kentucky referring to the Kentucky Derby, and horses figured prominently in this story, was published online as a dual language book in both Hebrew and in English. Now, before he wrote the story, Tomer could not have read the English version. But after he wrote it, he could. Because the scaffolding that was provided, whereby he was encouraged to write in the first language, write in the language he knew, and then work with the teacher to translate what he had written in Hebrew into English, taught him an enormous amount of English. The story connected with his life. He was passionate about horses. It affirmed his identity as somebody who had something to say that other kids and other people, his teachers, his parents, his friends back in Israel were interested in. It showcased his identity as an emerging bilingual and biliterate person. and it extended his knowledge of language dramatically. When we talked to Tomer after he had written and published the story, he had some very insightful things to say. He said, we asked him about, what was it like to use your first language in the classroom? And he said he was surprised at first that he was able to do this, but he said, I think using your first language is so helpful, because when you don't understand something after you've just come here, it's like beginning as a baby. Talk about an identity statement. Okay, that's what we're doing often with ESOL kids, when we don't pick up on the fact that they're not coming in only as deficient English speakers. They're coming in as emergent bilinguals, people who have a rich experience, even if they haven't developed much literacy in their first language due to their life circumstances. They have rich background experiences that have got to be connected to the curriculum. And if we treat them as babies, we're putting them in an even more vulnerable position than they are. He says, you don't know English, and you need to learn it all from the beginning. But if you already have it in another language, then it's easier. You can translate it, and you can do it in your language too, and then it's easier to understand the second language. What he's saying here is a very lucid version of what I've called the interdependence hypothesis, where there's a huge amount of research showing that students' languages are interdependent, or there's a lot of overlap between them, so that concepts that are known in one language can easily transfer to the other with appropriate exposure to the language. And so the level of a student's first language is a strong predictor of how well they're going to do in the second language. But we need to teach for transfer. So in this case, what the teacher was doing by encouraging Tomer to write in Hebrew was allowing him to express his literary talents in a language that he knew well, and then working from that basis to transfer that to English. And Tomer goes on to say, the first time I couldn't understand what his teacher Lisa was saying, except the word Hebrew. But I think it's very smart that you said to do it in our language, because we can't just sit in our hands doing nothing. And a lot of ESOL kids do sit on their hands doing nothing, because the teacher doesn't know that they are intellectually bright, that they're intellectually engaged if we give them the opportunity. But if we exclude students' first language from the classroom, we're limiting the opportunity that students have to showcase their intellectual accomplishments. There's another example that I'll share with you that shows the same reality, and again it comes from Lisa Leone's class. This was a story called The New Country, written by 3 students from Pakistani backgrounds. They were all Urdu speakers. Kanta and Salmana had been in Canada since grade 3. They were in grade 7 at this point, so they'd been in Canada for about 3.5 years. Their English was pretty good. Madiha, however, had just arrived, and she'd been in the country only about 6 weeks when they started this project. The project was a culminating project for a social studies unit, and social studies unit was on immigration. And so the students wanted to work together because they were friends and they came from the same community, and the teacher encouraged them to do that. They suggested to the teacher that they write a story based on their experiences of immigrating from rural Pakistan to high-rise Toronto, and that they could write this for younger students from the same background, and so they could do it in both languages. They could do it in Urdu as well as in English. And one of the reasons they suggested this also was that Madiha didn't know any English. So what they did was they discussed their story initially in Urdu. They discussed what the storyline was going to be. They invented a composite character called Sonia that was going to be the protagonist of the story. They discussed what was going to be on each page in terms of text, what the illustration should look like. All of this preparation, planning for their story, was done in Urdu. Madiha, despite knowing no English, minimal English, was a full participant in that. Then they wrote the initial draft of the story in English and shared it with the teacher, who gave them feedback, suggested some things, made some corrections, grammar, spelling, etc. They finalized their English version, and then they worked back from that English version to Urdu. And they found that there were some words that they didn't know in Urdu. They realized that they'd forgotten. The 2 students who'd been there for 3.5 years, they realized that they were forgetting quite a bit of their Urdu literacy. They had to go back and talk to their mums about how you'd say this in
in Urdu. But Medea, whose Urdu was probably the strongest because she was the most recent immigrant, was a full participant in that. And they published the story, and it's a 20-page story, beautifully illustrated, beautifully written, that's probably been read by thousands of people. It's up on a website, and is a story that all of the students are proud of. And for Medea, if you think about the messages that she was getting in this classroom as opposed to a more typical classroom, and in fact messages that she was getting in other classes in the school, she was getting the message that she had something to say, that she was intellectually accomplished, that her teacher was interested in her experiences, and it's something very different than a context that allows students to sit in their hands doing nothing.
We presented with the three students and Tomer at a conference a few years ago, and Kanta was very articulate and insightful about what this meant, this experience of writing in the two languages meant to them. The term that we've used to talk about this kind of project is identity texts, because students invest their identities in creating something that's meaningful to them. It could be a dual language story like this. It could be a single language story. It could be an iMovie or video that they create. It could be a PowerPoint. It could be a music CD that they create. But they invest their identities. It's their voices that are in here. And then once it's out there and shared with multiple audiences, and the web provides us a wonderful opportunity to do that, when it's shared with parents, when it's shared with friends back in the home country, when it's shared with teachers, when it's shared with peers, students receive feedback and affirmation on the basis of that sharing. So the identity text holds a mirror up to students in which their identities are reflected back in a positive light. And so if we go back to those three categories of underachievement, where the background characteristics that students are bringing into the school traditionally have interacted with what the school has provided to generate underachievement among low-income students, among students from non-English speaking backgrounds, and students from socially marginalized backgrounds. If we put this concept into our understanding of why these students are failing academically, what the school here is doing, what Lisa, the teacher, was doing, was challenging the assumption that classrooms and schools should be English-only zones. She was saying, I'm going to teach the whole child. This is something that is important for me. I want to get the most out of my students. I want them to be able to express themselves as powerfully as possible. And they can't do that if we arbitrarily exclude their first languages from the classroom. Here's what Kanta said about this experience in her presentation at this conference. She says, how it helped me, how being able to write in both languages, how it helped me was that when I came here in grade 4, the teachers didn't know what I was capable of. I was given a pack of crayons and a colouring book and told to get on colouring with it. And after that, I felt so bad about that. I'm capable of doing much more than just, I have my own inner skills to show the world other than just colouring. And I felt that those skills of mine are important also. So when we started writing the book, I could actually show the world that I am something instead of just colouring. And that's how it helped me, and it made me so proud of myself that I'm actually capable of doing something. And here today at the Ontario TESOL conference, I am actually doing something. I'm not just a colouring person. I can show you that I am something. So when we look at identity and look at the fact that it has been totally ignored as a relevant factor in understanding achievement and underachievement. It has been totally ignored in all previous education reform efforts. When you listen to voices like Kanta's, when you look at the research from the anthropological literature, the psychological literature, that has been ignored. If we want the Common Core state standards to be implemented effectively, we've got to inject an understanding of the role that human relationships and identity negotiations play in whether students are going to engage or not engage. So in the next section, what I'll do is look at a framework whereby, or a template, whereby we can look at some of the things that are important within the school context, and where we can take that literacy engagement framework and discuss how it might apply to our situation.